Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great week. In this week's project, I'm going to be working on a very simple abstract using watercolors. Since I've had a number of questions regarding the products I used, I thought it would be worth mentioning that I always list my products in the video description. But if you need to know specifically what I'm using because you'd like to buy that product, you can always reach out to me if I haven't been detailed enough in my video description. Moving forward, however, I do plan on being a little bit more detailed, but please keep in mind that sometimes the products I use may not be available in your area. So I'd like to encourage you to experiment and use the products that you can find in your area, and most importantly, use the products that you love working with. When I'm starting to work on my background, I generally like to work with light washes of color and gradually build to darker layers of color as I go on. You'll notice that in this layer I'm using what's called a wet on wet technique. So that means that my layers of wet paint are touching each other. So when one new color is added next to a color that is still wet, it will tend to bleed into that color, and I like the effects that creates. Once I'm done adding all the colors for my background, I'll let this layer dry. When I'm not pressed for time, I generally like to let my paintings layers dry naturally. But if I need to use a tool to dry the surface, I prefer to use, for instance, a hairdryer on a cool setting rather than using the hot setting. I especially like to use the cool setting when I have my paper taped down, such as in this case. When I use the cool setting, I have less of a chance of melting the glue from the tape and it leaving a residue on my paper. Now I'll start to intensify my colors by adding less water to my paints and going over the colors that I want to make more vibrant. To soften the edges of the paint I just applied, I use a clean, wet brush. This is another example of working wet on wet. When I'm applying this Alizarin crimson, the layer of blue is still wet, and when the two of them touch, they blend into each other. In this case, the alizarin crimson and the blue will blend together to create a deep purple, and this will add yet more color and dimension to my painting. Now that my final layer of paint is dry, I'm going to start working with my white pen. One thing I've noticed in this style of painting is that I always like my paintings best when I keep them as simple as possible. You'll notice that when I'm working in this way, painting abstract using watercolors, I keep my details very simple. As I've mentioned before, the simpler the better. I tend to like my paintings better when they're simpler. And keeping them simple also makes them a little bit more relaxing. If I'm too worried on trying to create something complicated, it becomes less of an enjoyable process for me. Using white next to these darker values of color helps to create contrast. An easy way to keep painting interesting is to make sure I use light, medium, and dark values of color. The white here creates my lightest value of color, and the black in this painting that I'm adding right now using stippling will create my darkest value of color. Everything else in between will be a different variation on the values, and it will make the painting more interesting. Normally I prefer to work with my black fountain pen when I'm adding details like this, but I recently ran out of ink and I'm waiting to get a new pen with refillable ink. And so in the meantime I'm using this Posca pen. I don't think it will affect the marker too much, being that I'm creating stippling, so I'm just dotting the marker up and down. But if I were to rub the tip of this pen on the paper, being that the surface of the paper is a bit rough, it might damage the tip of the marker, and for that reason I prefer using, like I said, my fountain pen. This pen here has a very fine tip, and I like to use it when I want to add very slight details that sort of blend into the background. It has a metal tip, and for that reason I like using it on watercolor paper because I don't need to worry that the paper will damage my pen. Adding iridescent colors to a painting is another nice way to create contrast. And of course, this is especially true if most of the paints in the painting are not iridescent. I've decided to add these little streaks of gold in some parts of the painting where the gold will be more noticeable, and then in other parts of the painting where it will be especially noticeable when the light catches the painting a certain way, but not always visible. Flipping my painting around or sideways is a nice way for me to get a new perspective on my work. And of course, it also makes it sometimes much more easier for me to work. And I know it's nice when you're watching a video for things not to move too much, but it can be very difficult to create the kind of strokes that I want to create if I don't change the angle of my painting. So I apologize when I have to do this, but it really is necessary, otherwise I wouldn't do it. As I mentioned before, I really like to keep my paintings as simple as possible. So the very last thing I will do to this painting is add some splatters of dark color on the very top, because there's a little bit too much of a light value of color up there, and I want to create a little bit of contrast. Now that my painting is complete, let's have a closer look at it. I hope this video has offered you some inspiration and some helpful tips. Watercolor techniques don't need to be complicated to bring you beautiful results. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!